My brother Kyle and I have wildly different tastes in games, and beyond BioWare and Final Fantasy, there's never been a ton of crossover in our media tastes. That being said, single-player games have always had a communal aspect to them for my brother and I, and when I lived with him during college, I would watch him play games sometimes. This is the reason I played Dragon Age Origins for the first time, which would go on to become one of my favorite games ever made. Another game he used to play that I always thought looked cool is Dragon's Dogma. He picked it up either right before deploying to Afghanistan or right after returning, and when he got it, he was addicted to playing it on his PS3. From the onset, the big monster fights were iconic, and the way the characters are able to climb all over the monsters is an inspired bit of game design, a design element that wouldn't show up in any other game since. This was somewhere between 2013 and 2014, and at my brother's urging, I would give Dragon's Dogma a go, and promptly put it down after roughly an hour or two of playing. At this time, my gaming tastes were admittedly pretty limited. I played BioWare games, Bethesda RPGs, Final Fantasy games, and Mortal Kombat, stepping out of my wheelhouse only for games that looked especially cool to me. I was running deep into Civilization V, Endless Space, and Dota 2 around this time as well, and I was also into competitive Magic the Gathering. Dragon's Dogma is a game unlike any of the ones I'd listed, and when its approach to fantasy didn't match up well with what I wanted from a fantasy game, primarily a good story and interesting characters, I cast it aside, until I would try it again a few years down the line. Thus, my history with Dragon's Dogma is a complicated one. I admired it from afar, but whenever I laid my hands upon it, I was rebuked by its design decisions, which at the time of me being in my late teens, were not palatable to my close-minded gaming tastes. 2 years later, though, I would try Dragon's Dogma again, and this time, I would get a little bit further. I would get to Grand Soren, I would explore the city a little, and I would promptly drop the game again when I realized fast travel didn't exist. Well, it does, but I hadn't come across the mechanic yet. In my limited perception of how open-world games should be designed, I had only Bethesda games to compare to Dragon's Dogma 2, and at that time, I considered walking through an open world to be borderline tedious anytime after the first route. Therefore, I couldn't be asked to walk back and forth through an open world to complete tasks the game requested of me. And so, I put Dragon's Dogma down once more, and this time I would stay away from the game until 2020. 2017 was the year I began to really expand my gaming horizons. I played my first MMO, Final Fantasy XIV, with my brother and a friend. I dove headfirst into the Souls series, playing every Souls game released up until that point, and I started to view video games with a more critical eye, devouring a back catalog of WatchMojo top 10 lists, What Culture, PlayStation Access, and Outside Extra. I was finally introduced to games media and the concept of discussing games to any deeper level, of considering them as something more than a way of becoming immersed into another world or relaxing after a day of work. The beauty of gaming is something I always revered, and gaming had had a major impact on my life, the impacts of which I had thought deeply upon, but I didn't think about games within the gaming industry or their quality as juxtaposed against one another. 2017 was the year I started working on my top 100 lists for each decade, and it was the year I started crafting my extensive backlog. For 3 years, I devoured the backlog, playing literally hundreds of games called the best ever made. And in 2020, I would see an opportunity to dive deeper into the hobby with the time afforded me by a certain global pandemic. I played older games, giving things I had written off unfairly another chance. Dragon's Dogma, this time arisen from the dark on PS4, was one such title, and I got back to where I was, took the Mercedes escort quest, and got killed in 2 hits by lizards in the well. Dying twice, I uninstalled the game and moved on to other things, feeling 3 chances was enough. But 3 years later, in 2023, I would give Dragon's Dogma a 4th and final chance, and it was all because of the gameplay trailers for Dragon's Dogma 2. The sequel coming out in a few months looks so good. I re-downloaded Dark Arisen once again, steeling myself for the experience. This time was going to be it. Through hell and high water, I was going to at least roll credits on this game. And I did it. And not only did I do it, but I can confidently say, it took 10 years, but I finally get it. I get Dragon's Dogma, Dark Arisen. With that too long intro out of the way, you're watching Rail Deal Games, and I hope you like this Rail Deal review. How do I talk about a game I have so much history with? How do I explain why I like Dragon's Dogma enough to finish it this time when, for my previous 3 attempts, I made it little more than an hour or 2 into the experience? Those are tough questions to answer, and the only way to do so is to articulate and establish my tiers of gaming design. The 3 pillars I found to be the most important aspects of a game. Firstly, gameplay is the most important aspect of any game. A game with good gameplay can be a masterpiece based on that gameplay alone. Secondly, a story can add immersion to an experience gameplay can't always do on its own. And sometimes, a great story can make up for bad or mediocre gameplay, such as in the Last of Us series. Thirdly, is the cross-section between graphics and art design. It's a hierarchy. Each pillar matters, but they matter to differing degrees. In my first attempts of Dragon's Dogma, I put a higher premium on story, and well, story is the game's weakest aspect. Considering the games I was playing at the time, games like Dragon Age Origins and other 7th generation games, this makes sense. Past me wasn't predisposed to enjoy Dragon's Dogma for what it is. The best 7 out of 10 game ever made. I'm going to spoil Dragon's Dogma in this review. I'm going to spoil its mechanics, its story, and its surprises. If you care about that, you need to sign off now. I'll be talking firstly about gameplay, then about the story of the game, and I'll try to be as comprehensive as I can with my 36 to 39 hours of total experience with the game. My most recent playthrough was 33, but I'm estimating my other 3 attempts totaled close to 3 to 6 hours. When I first booted up Dark Arisen, I was hyped to get a bump of that rockin' J-Rock that lives in the deepest recesses of my memory from the days when my brother would play this game all the time. But on this attempt of Dark Arisen, I realized that the J-Rock main menu song had been changed. What it's been replaced with is fine, but there was something about the J-Rock song Into Free that really set up the Dragon's Dogma experience. It's weird to pair J-Rock with a Western fantasy game like DD, but that unique oddness really foreshadowed what the player was in for with Dragon's Dogma. This game is just not like anything else out on the market, and the best way to elucidate this point is to talk about the gameplay. I've played hundreds of games since my last crack at this title, and the positive side of that is that now I'm able to better articulate aspects of this game that differ from others. From the outset, the first thing that stood out to me about DD is how abilities are not tied to a cooldown. They are instead tied to stamina, which is unusual for this type of game. Most games will limit abilities on a cooldown, but I really like this unique approach to character abilities. Maybe it's the fact that I platinumed Dark Souls in 2022, a process I took my time with and would leave me with 260 hours of the remaster under my belt. I loved the Souls series from the first moment I started playing them in 2017, and while stamina management is crucially important in that genre of game, its importance in other games is usually muted in comparison. I picked a fighter on this playthrough since I figured it would give me the best opportunities to play to my strengths. In that Dark Souls Platinum experience I just mentioned, I played a lot of parry builds, something I did not do in any of the games my first time through them. And after 267 hours, I got good at parrying, and this spilled over into every game I've played since with a parry mechanic. Logically, I guessed it would come up in Dragon's Dogma, hence my picking of the fighter class, but it never came up. Instead, stamina management was the transferable skill from Dark Souls that would show up many times throughout my DD playthrough. From my first Stinger Lunge, I learned abilities could be spammed. From my second consecutive one, I learned abilities burn stamina to balance out their spammability. This matters a lot because of the core component of the combat in Dragon's Dogma, climbing on monsters. This is the key selling point of Dragon's Dogma, and honestly on its own, it makes the game worth at least trying. Essentially, any large boss-sized enemy can be climbed upon, and the climbing on these enemies can provide distinct and significant combat advantages. For example, when a Cyclops swings at someone, there's a chance to jump and grab a hold of his back, providing the player a venue to climb around to the front of his face and dip their sword into some eye jelly. Ooh, sweet, sweet eye jelly. Or, and this is my favorite example of where climbing can be useful in combat, to ride a griffin. Early on, griffins are terrifying enemies. They can kill in one hit, but eventually the player gets a chance at revenge, and when I finally got my chance to bag a griffin, I did it in the coolest way possible. As it started to take off, I grabbed its tail, climbed up the tail to get on its back while it flew around, and using my freshly flaming sword, set its wings ablaze to smote it against the cold, curt stones of the forgotten Colosseum. It is literally one of the most epic and engaging fights I've done in a game, and it made the 33 hours I spent with this game worth every second. And this anecdote brings up another important aspect of DD's combat design. Unlike most games, there's a verticality to the combat encounters in Dark Arisen the player has to engage with. The Fighter and Mystic Knight classes, which are the two I used, have abilities specifically for taking down or otherwise interacting with flying enemies. While climbing is good for handling the verticality of things like griffins, other moves are better at taking out harpies and liches. Sometimes, jumping at the right moment and grabbing a harpy in the air can be a great way of managing the verticality of fighting them, but usually anti-air abilities are better and safer. On the topic of grappling, though, all normal-sized enemies can be grappled and thrown, and I definitely abused this skill to cast many a goblin off of the seaside cliffs surrounding the domain of Grand Soren. I also love the health mechanic in this game. The way max health decreases as you get hit, and there's only a range of recoverable health, is super cool. It's just a super unique system that begs you to use the ends around the world. In mechanics in games are usually useless wastes of time, but in Dragon's Dogma, the ends are a required mechanic. All of these gameplay mechanics are simply amazing, but gameplay mechanics matter little if the enemies they are meant to be used on are boring, a problem Dragon's Dogma doesn't have. Dragon's Dogma, the game with a wholly unique monster climbing mechanic, fantastic implementation of lighting, and misogynistic ogres. You see, the monsters in Dragon's Dogma all have some type of personality, represented either through the way they act or how they respond to elemental effects. The framing of the monsters themselves within the world and how the player is presented with them is part of what makes them stand out so much, and it's no wonder that something Dragon's Dogma does masterfully with the craftsmanship of their creatures is the way each is foreshadowed to the player previous to the point when they are encountered in the closed world. We'll get into this later, but Dragon's Dogma is often described as an open world game, but I disagree. A good example of this foreshadowing is when the player encounters their first large monster, a chimera. This happens within the tutorial, and it sets a precedent of DD introducing the player to a weakened version of each monster before they'll encounter them through the critical path of the story. Within the tutorialized Chimera fight, the pawns will do all of the major fighting, and the player-controlled character doesn't need to do anything. The tutorialized fights continue a decent way into the campaign, with the next one being a weakened ogre, so weakened it poses little challenge to the newly minted Arisen. After finishing that fight, the player almost immediately fights a Hydra, but only long enough to knock a head off of it. All of these fights teach the player how to interact with large enemies that wouldn't work in any other game. As soon as the player takes the Hydra head to the domain of Grand Soren, the shadow of a distant threat begins to periodically fly over the player. This shadow foreshadows the eventual Griffin hunt, leading to that epic Griffin takedown I mentioned before. Not all enemies are as great though. I hate the golems in this game. They do a good job at forcing the player to engage with the climbing mechanic, but I don't like the way this limits the player's ability to manage this beast. It is probably because I played a warrior and a mystic knight on this playthrough, but I just couldn't manage this enemy type that well. After exploring for 40 minutes to get to the Griffin's nest, I got grabbed one single time when the golem only had a sliver of health left, and he was able to take me from full health to 0 in that one grab. I lost 40 minutes of progress over that. And Dragon's Dogma is full of these small little moments that show the rough, sinewy connecting tissue of this game's design. The design of the open world that is more closed than truly open, and the story show off these rough edges occasionally too. The world is a fairly box-standard Western fantasy setting with a few interesting curiosities. The pawns, an element of DD's mythos I'm not particularly fond of, are one of these oddities. My problem with pawns isn't that they exist, it's just that I don't like how void they are. They're these empty husks that not only follow the player around, but they also dot the world map, filling it up with characters that aren't interesting at all. Now, Capcom cares more about gameplay than story, which has always been the case, but I would have preferred a few more interesting people to talk to instead of these walking mannequins everywhere. Open worlds are not just the things within them though. An open world can be loaded with activities and still be bad, such as what Ubisoft has done with the genre over the past 12 years or so. Dragon's Dogma isn't the prototypical open world, and as I said before, I wouldn't even call it an open world as such. It's open almost in a similar way to how Metal Gear Solid 5 is open. There are fairly large areas, but all of these areas where traversal matters are sectioned off from one another by extremely linear and tight pathways. As such, the world map really isn't that large, nor is it that open. The map doesn't need to be large though, because the traversal of it is mostly interesting. While there's not a ton of mobility options for the player to use during the exploration of the closed world, there are some mechanics in DD that make exploration fun, and at times stressful, in a good way. For example, Capcom wasn't scared of putting some pretty dangerous traps in this game, such as this time when bandits tried to kill me with a giant boulder.
Be watchful.
I love boulder traps in games, such as this time it happened in Baldur's Gate 3.
Oh, Lord.
Firstly, fast travel is a limited mechanic in DD, and this is a good thing. The point where an open world becomes pointless is when the player fast travels everywhere instead of experiencing the world as it is intended to be experienced. To fast travel in DD, the player needs a fairy stone, which is a single-use item that only transports the player to one of the two major cities or to a port crystal they've manually placed down themselves. I like this personally, or at least I did for most of the experience. The DD world is not designed in such a way that it is interesting to run back and forth between, meaning this is unfortunately a game where the open world isn't that interesting to explore after the first go-around or so, and it doesn't have fast travel. The thing is, I can see what the Capcom team were going for with this one. The idea of creating your own fast travel networks is interesting, but it's the type of thing that can only really work in a world that is more open than the one DD has. It was soon after I was getting tired of traversing the closed world that I discovered the infinite use fairy stone included in the Dark Arisen version of DD, and once I knew I had access to that, I used it for the rest of the playthrough. While the open world doesn't live up to the potential in the raw exploration, the traversal of it is interesting. Most of the time. 3 mechanics make this happen. 1. The overbearing darkness. 2. The at times punishing wait mechanics. And 3. The limited and sporadic autosaves. Few autosaves add stakes to each encounter in the closed world, and while the player does have the option to save whenever they want outside of encounters, not worrying about saving is something I've grown accustomed to in the era of modern gaming. I like to treat this like a PS2 game in that way, where I only saved at the start of a new area or in a town. Treating DD like this was tricky at times because of the other 2 mechanics. The wait mechanic, for instance, is fantastic. The distribution of items found in the world makes this particular aspect of the gameplay function as a pseudo-survival game mechanic. What I mean by that is that in a survival game you'll go out into the world to get resources and come back to the main base to drop things off before going out again. Since I didn't use the infinite fairy stone in the early game, this mechanic mirrored that survival game mechanic a little bit. Being heavy creates the consequence of slowing down the exploration elements of the game, but for most of my time with the title, I didn't really care that much. My favorite atmospheric feature of DD is the dark. The dark sections are so good. One of my biggest problems with RPGs is the way status ailments aren't immersive, but Dragon's Dogma fixes that by making the world feel dark and scary in the depths. One of my favorite classes to RP in a game is that of a paladin or cleric, and most games make this RP surface level at best. In DD though, every time I went to any type of catacombs, I felt the dark permeating my experience at every level, and I really got to feel like a holy warrior in an unholy place, in a way no other game ever lets me. My first time watching my brother play this game was when I first experienced the darkness of Dragon's Dogma. He was walking around in the woods, his path alight only by the shaking, flickering fades of his lantern. Off the beaten path, he saw glowing lights appear in the dark, and in less than a second, the lion's head appeared and pounced upon his pack of pawns. This was the moment when I first wanted to play the game, and the darkness mechanic is the whole reason I tried Dragon's Dogma out for the first time 10 years ago. And so, it wasn't the combat, monsters, or world design that deterred me from enjoying the game on my first 3 attempts. The quest design is one of the elements that held me back from enjoying the game. Most quests in the game are simple kill X of enemy Y quests, very much in the vein of the traditional MMO side quest. However, Dragon's Dogma has another common type of quest, the escort mission. When you first get to Grand Soren, there's a quest on the inn board prompting the player to escort Mercedes to a place far off in the distance. This quest is a beginner player trap because it takes you by enemies that are far too difficult for a low-level player to beat. In my first 3 attempts, I never made it past this quest, and this quest did a good job at getting me to quit the game each time. On this playthrough, I failed the Mercedes escort side quest. It sucks to lose out on what I read is a pretty good shield, and it also sucks that the quests took me once again to places I wasn't ready for. I was hoping I was just being a wimp on my first 3 attempts, but I ended up running into chimeras twice, approaching the quest from 2 different angles, and I wasn't even close to ready to be fighting a bunch of chimeras. That being said, I liked the unforgiving nature of this quest line. I failed because I took her with me to the underwater temple and she died down there. This was stupid of me, and I deserved to lose out on the XP and rewards. Once I realized I wasn't ready for the quest, I should have gone back to the board and cancelled the quest. I didn't do that though, and I liked the way Capcom was willing to punish me, the player, for stepping out of my lane. The consequences of failing that quest weren't too far-reaching though, because Mercedes was still alive somehow, which brings me to the worst aspect of DD, the story. The character models are okay for 2012, and admittedly, while the voice acting is bad, it's clear Capcom focused on the other systems I've talked about. The story is not great at all though. The main quest line is pretty much made exclusively of grabbing a set of quests that set you out into the world without an interesting main story to follow or any characters to feel connected with. And there are times the quest lines in this game are purely nonsensical. I started this quest line where the Duke's wife wished to speak with me, and when I completed the quest it took me past this point of no return type thing that I didn't want to do quite yet, so I exited the game and reloaded. When I reloaded, however, I was in the dungeon and I had been caught by the guards. It's a bug that soiled my experience with the quest a little bit. But, and this is the weirdest thing, I still had the skeleton key that the Duke's wife gives you upon the end of the quest. So weird. At the point of writing this, I don't know how this messed up my save, and the Duke didn't seem to care? Why is this quest here, and what happened? Beyond this, there's a required main quest regarding Mercedes and her place in the military of Grand Soren. In some ways, this quest is modeled much in the way the companion quest in Dragon Age Origins are. However, you complete this quest and it doesn't even matter. It doesn't have any place in the story, and I think it was just for building up a romance speeder with her, which moves us on to the next point. The companions and romances in this game are so awkward. The side characters like Mercedes and Quina, or however you pronounce her name, don't have much more personality than the pawns, and it creates these truly odd romance encounters within the game. I think the vision for this game was to be something that rivaled the role-playing heights of Dragon Age Origins, and in the gameplay department, Capcom did a great job in creating RP systems. However, the characters do not have the same writing chops. This awkwardness in execution is nowhere more prescient than when the Arisen finally confronts the dragon. What's in a man's heart? Are we inherently bad, struggling to attain any level of goodness? These are the questions the dragon poses the Arisen, and the way he chooses to represent this moral and ethical query to the player? He tells the Arisen that they either fight him to save the one they love, or leave and attain wealth and riches immeasurable. That's what the Duke did after the conclusion of the tutorial, after all, and this would be a great way to end the main campaign of DD, except for one major issue. The choice to abandon the love interest would be a far better mechanic if the romances were clearer in this game. I got the witch person, but I honestly don't even know her name. Not that I have a different romance option in mind, because I honestly don't know anything about any of them. What's funny about this is I only talked to the witch once, and it wasn't like a romance conversation. I even took Quina on a quest, so I would think I would have a higher companion rating with her, but that's just not how the mechanic works. The characters and writing are just the oddest and roughest aspect of Dragon's Dogma.
By my command.
What is your purpose here, Arisen? If you sought to live, you had naught but run and hide yourself away. But then, tell me, child of man, What does it mean to live in truth? To wage war against the passing of days. To pray to the unseen for a few breaths more. To raise grand cities from stone and spawn new life in turn.
And it's a shame because the dogma of the dragon is actually a great thematic aspect. The dragon will kill everybody, but really he's there to test the righteousness of his chosen dragon forge, giving them the option for wealth instead. I really like this idea, and this is the thing I'm hoping Capcom is able to shore up their writing for when the sequel drops later this year. The final thing to talk about now is the final boss, the dragon. I'm not actually a big fan of this boss fight, to be honest. There's some major epicness to it, sure, but I like a lot of the other big enemy encounters in the game way more. The griffin encounter in the nest is better, for example. The framing of the scene with the lightning flashes and the swirling air just makes the climactic confrontation with the griffin so cool. It's not like the dragon doesn't have some great effects in his boss fight, but he's actually less foreshadowed in the main story of the game than the griffin was. The griffin will swoop in to harass the player, thereby creating a connection to the player and it. The dragon just kind of exists, and as such his boss fight feels less climactic than it should. Whenever I finish a game, I always ask myself one question. Will this game make my top 100 list for the decade of its release? Dragon's Dogma will not, but if it had a bit better writing, and if the questing was just a little bit better as well, it might have had a shot. This is what has me hopeful for Dragon's Dogma 2. Dark Arisen is a proof of concept, and I'm truly hyped for the sequel now. So should you play Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen? I would say yes. The game is the best 7 out of 10 game I've ever played, but if you play it, just go in knowing there are some major rough edges to the game. I would even say that if you don't like this game, you should still consider checking out the sequel if it ends up being good. If you'd like to know how the sequel shapes up, consider subscribing. I plan to cover that game when it releases, and while I can tell you right now I won't have a review finished until the game is a month or two old, if you'd like the way I reviewed this game, you'll like the way I review Dragon's Dogma 2 in 6 months or so. And that's the video, guys. If you liked the video, please smash that like button and leave a comment telling me your thoughts on my video. And if you have a moment right now, consider checking out some of my other videos on the screen. Whatever you choose to do, have an awesome day, gamers.